In the previous lecture, we discussed the development we undergo from the womb through childhood, which sets the stage for the next step in our physical, cognitive, and social development, adolescence. This lecture will cover this period of extreme changes onward through the remainder of our lives. Adolescence as we currently view it in the West is a recent social construction. That is, the idea of an extended childhood is not a universal belief about the function of adolescence. However, most cultures do recognize it as a period of immense changes. For example, the Jewish culture celebrates bar and bat mitzvahs as a time of transition from childhood into adulthood. During this period of time, we form our identities and further define our place in our social world. We discussed Piaget's stages of cognitive development in the previous lecture. Erik Erikson developed a stage theory of social development which runs from childhood through our entire lifespan. He believed that each stage is marked by a crisis, or a challenge that we need to overcome. Failing to do so could lead to psychosocial issues that would remain throughout our lives. Adolescence is one of these stages, and later in the lecture we will discuss the specific social-psychological crisis of this period. However, as you know, having experienced this period, it is one of transition, often quite extreme in nature. Just as with our discussion of childhood, we'll discuss the physical, cognitive, and social developments that occur in adolescence, and then we will end with a discussion of these same aspects of development in adulthood. Do you recall the physical changes that occurred during adolescence? What were they? The physical changes of adolescence are known as puberty, where we develop into sexual maturity. That is, the ability to father or mother children. On average, this period occurs sooner in girls than boys. We can see this by looking at middle schoolers and their height, with girls often being taller than their male classmates. So what specific changes occur? Well, for one, we hit a growth spurt, which is rapid development driven by an increase in sex hormones. During puberty, our primary sexual organs develop fully. For men, the development of the penis and testes. In women, the ovaries fully develop and begin releasing ova. Additionally, our secondary sexual characteristics develop. I should mention here two related but not identical terms, which are valuable to know. Scientists refer to sex as the biological differences between males and females. Gender is the socially constructed role of men and women. The secondary sexual characteristics are the physical changes that occur during puberty that are not directly related to reproduction. These include the development of pubic and body hair in both males and females, facial hair and deepening of the voice in males, and breast and hip development in females. In addition to massive changes in sexual characteristics, our brains are also undergoing development as well. Recall during childhood, the majority of development occurs is the increase in synaptic connections. Adolescence is marked instead by an increase in the pruning of the synaptic connections that are not used. This pruning makes the remaining connections more efficient. Additionally, the neurons in our frontal cortex grow myelin, which also speeds up connections. The frontal cortex is responsible for many of our higher functions, including morality, personality, and rational thought. This development lags behind the development of the limbic system, which is responsible for many emotions. This can often lead to emotional outbursts and impulses that are difficult to regulate, since that regulation relies on the frontal cortex, which is not fully developed until our mid-20s. Perhaps you can recall this type of behavior either in yourself or your friends. Since our brains are undergoing major changes, you can imagine that our cognitive abilities are also undergoing development. One major change that we undergo in adolescence is our new strong awareness of social situations and our place in them. We become aware of our own thinking, what is known as metacognition. We think more about the thoughts and perspectives of other people. We also further train our theory of mind by thinking at an additional higher level about what other people are thinking about us. Finally, we form and strengthen our beliefs about ideals, or the way things should be. That is, we start developing morality. This often leads to criticisms of society, parents, and ourselves. Recall that Piaget called this period the formal operational stage, in which we start to think symbolically about things that are not visible or concrete. These can include things like ideas about good and evil, right and wrong, fairness, equity, and God. This combination of formal operations and idealism can often lead to protest or other activism as adolescents struggle with how things are and how they think they should be. As we can see from the recent uprisings in the Arab world and elsewhere, most protests and revolutions are driven by the youth of the culture. Lawrence Kohlberg developed a stage theory of moral development, similar to what Piaget did for cognitive development. He tested what stage people were in by having them respond to hypothetical moral dilemmas. For example, participants were told about a man whose wife was dying, and there was medicine that could save her life. However, the man could not afford the medicine. Should the man steal the drug or not? The three levels are in ascending order: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. People at the pre-conventional level respond in ways that reflect morality based on avoiding punishment or gaining reward. In response to the question about whether you should steal to save a loved one, people at this level may respond that he should do so because it will feel better. Or they might respond that he shouldn't because he could go to jail. At the conventional level, which generally starts at adolescence, our morality is based around conforming to social norms, which can include laws or avoiding disapproval. At this stage, people may say that the man shouldn't steal since it's against the law, or people might think him a bad person. At the post-conventional level, people make judgments based on more abstract principles, including personal ideology. At this level, people might say that the man should steal the drug, since life is more sacred than law. Or while theft is immoral, charging too much for a life-saving drug is worse. Some criticisms of Kohlberg's theory have been made. For one, Kohlberg's model focuses mostly on cognition and its impact on morality, while other processes, including emotion, empathy, and similarity, are also important to morality. Another criticism is that not all cultures progress through all steps, and within cultures, not all people reach post-conventional. Finally, people themselves vary on which stage they use in different situations. There's a much more detailed discussion of morality this week in your third lecture. As we age, we tend to go from very egocentric, self-focused behaviors to more caring, less selfish ones. One of the videos this week discusses changes in the brain that occur during adolescence that impact these behaviors. Specifically, we become better at recognizing emotions in other people, which increases our empathy, which in turn leads to less selfish behaviors. During adolescence, which we've seen, we begin to think differently about other people. We also have changes in how we think about our place in our social groups. As mentioned in the first part of this lecture, Erik Erikson developed a stage theory of social development. Each stage is accompanied by a challenge or crisis. For example, at the earliest stage of our social development, the challenge is between trust or mistrust. As we discussed in the previous lecture, whether we trust our primary caregiver to supply us with attention and comfort can have an impact on whether we're securely or insecurely attached. So what is the challenge of adolescence? Think about your own experience socially in high school. What was your primary concern at this time? Erikson's observation was that this is a period in which we're trying to determine who we are. That is, what is our identity? While adolescent rebellion is not a human universal, it is a period of time in which we form our identity. In collectivist cultures, the role and identities are much more determined by group membership and social norms. The Western world is much more individualistic. Therefore, adolescents in the West might try out many different identities before settling into a more stable one. Identity is important, since it is a strong determinant of who we will be and who our friends and romantic partners will be. Culture has a huge effect on our identities. What gender we identify as and the social roles that accompany it can also have a major impact on how we see ourselves, as well as how others see us. These cultural beliefs and the degree to which we encode them in our own mind results in schemas about what the appropriate behaviors of each gender are in our society. However, on occasion, the schemas that people have about their own gender or place in the world doesn't match that of their culture, which can result in psychological distress as well as discrimination. As mentioned earlier, sex are the physical characteristics of male and female, and gender are the social differences. Sometimes these two don't match. That is, a person identifies as different from their biological sex. Biology can come into conflict with identity and cause psychosocial distress. For example, your textbook discusses the case of Bruce Reimer, who after a botched circumcision was physically altered to remove his testes and the remainder of his penis. His parents raised him as a girl, changing his name to Brenda. Once he entered puberty, he began to receive female hormones. Even though she didn't know she was born a boy, she still acted in typically male ways, being more aggressive in play style. Once the hormones resulted in the development of secondary sexual characteristics, such as breasts, Brenda felt that the body she was in was foreign and became emotionally distressed. Eventually, her parents told her the truth, and she immediately decided to return to being male. Thus, biology has a strong impact on our gender identity. Gender identity occurs very early in our development, due to an interplay of internal factors, such as hormones and brain structures, and external factors, such as the intrauterine environment. Transgendered individuals are people who identify as a gender not matching their biological sex, and this condition is thought to originate during the prenatal brain development. In our early social development, our parents are the primary drivers of identity. As we age, this influence decreases. However, even in adolescence, they still have a major impact upon us. For example, our attitudes towards religion and career choice correlate highly with that of our parents. However, adolescence is a period in which we are developing individuality, and thus our relationships with our parents begins to take a backseat to that with our peers. Early in development, we begin to reflect the characteristics of our peers. For example, at about 1 year of age, we imitate the children around us. In adolescence, this process intensifies, with acceptance to our peer group becoming of central importance. We find and join groups of similar others, be it on interests, appearance, and other factors. Those on the outside of the group can point to the similarities in these groups. However, members of these groups may not see themselves as that similar, instead thinking of members of the group as being very individualistic. I think of the punks of the 1970s and 80s. Their attitude was one of nonconformity. However, they tended to wear the same style of clothing, get their hair cut in similar ways, and listen to the same music. This is not surprising, since we are drawn towards similar others and begin to take on their perspectives and styles. Thus we become more and more alike to those we spend time with. Even though adolescence is a time in which we gain more and more independence, our parents still have a lot of influence upon us. Parents' attitudes and behaviors can either facilitate or interfere with their teenagers' development of autonomy. Parents who are flexible and adjust their behaviors and attitudes to take into account their own personality and that of their child typically have teenagers who have the best outcomes. Since adolescence is a time when teenagers are trying out new identities, new experiences, and new autonomy, accompanied by less ability to regulate their emotions and behaviors than adults, it is understandable why there are conflicts between them and their parents. In fact, this conflict can have positive outcomes. For example, it can teach teenagers how to negotiate, critical thinking, empathy, and communication skills. Thus, while peers are becoming more important, empathetic, compassionate, and loving parents are still needed and vital to social development. Eventually, adolescence ends, and the longest stage of our lifespan begins, adulthood. Erikson broke down adulthood into various stages. However, this period is the most difficult to define specific time periods in which we move from one stage to the other. The first stage is early adulthood, which starts at the end of adolescence and goes into our 20s. This is a transitory period in which people are still making important decisions about their life trajectories, such as about education, career, and marriage. This is also the time when our frontal lobes become fully developed, and we tend to be at our peak physical health. After this point, our physical abilities begin to decline. However, the good news is that this generally happens gradually and imperceptibly. However, illness can speed up this decline. The next stage in development is middle adulthood, which typically begins in our 30s. Between our 20s and 40s, a number of physical changes occur. These are slow declines in muscle mass, bone density, and sensory abilities. The good news is that we can resist the declines in both physical and cognitive abilities by using them regularly. As you will see when we discuss health and well-being, these processes are linked. So it's best to take care of both our bodies and our minds. When we discuss health and well-being, we will talk about some ways to do this. Also at around 50, women begin to go through menopause, which is the decrease in hormones and fertility. The final stage is late adulthood, which begins after we enter our 60s. At around 70, our senses begin to decline more rapidly. As you can see in these charts, our sight, smell, and hearing rapidly develop in our early years, reaching a peak in our 20s and 30s, where they remain relatively the same. Then in our 70s, there's a sharp downward decline in all three. In addition to decreases in sensory abilities, there's a marked decline in reaction time in people in their 70s. Looking at this accident data, we can see that accident rates are very high in adolescence, partly due to impulsive and reckless driving that may be due to underdeveloped frontal lobes, along with being new to driving. Then it declines in our 20s and stays low until about 55, when it starts to slowly increase, with a sharp upward trend in people in their 70s. Thus, some states now require older drivers to pass reaction time tests to maintain their license. So we've seen that late adulthood comes with progressively declining physical and sensory abilities, as well as declines in reaction times. Do other cognitive abilities also decrease with age? What do you think? Does memory decline? How about intelligence? Well, the answer to the memory question is mixed. Our ability to recall information does decrease with age. Recall is the ability to draw something from memory. For example, you run into someone you know. Can you recall their name? Well, as you probably realize, this will depend on how well you know someone. In a test of this process, people were shown many pictures of individuals paired with their names. Some of these individuals they saw once, some twice, and others they saw 3 times. They were then shown the photos later and asked to recall the name of each. As you can see in this graph, people recalled the names correctly more often when they saw them more times. However, the older the participants, the worse they were, regardless of the number of times they saw the photo. So older people have greater difficulty with recall. However, as I mentioned, the answer on memory was mixed. So the decline is not identical for all memory tasks. Age does not seem to interfere with recognition. Recognition is the ability to pick the correct answer out of a set. We can think of recognition like multiple choice questions, and recall like fill in the blank. As you can see in this graph, regardless of the age, people do better on recognition than recall tasks. The older participants did worse on the recall tasks, but did not have declines on recognition tasks. Thus, the effect of age on memory is not simply a decline across the board. What about intelligence? Well, the story about the effect of age on intelligence is also not straightforward. Some researchers break up intelligence into 2 broad categories: fluid and crystalline. Fluid intelligence is our ability to reason quickly and abstractly, and this type of intelligence does decline with age. Crystalline intelligence is the sum of our skills, abilities, and knowledge that we gain over time. The good news is that this type of intelligence does not decline. In fact, it continues to grow over time. The physical and cognitive developments of adulthood are typically quite slow. Our social development during these years can be more abrupt. Many social changes can and do occur during our adult years, such as starting a career, maybe ending a career and starting another one, getting married, maybe also getting divorced. Having children can also have a profound effect on social development. Erikson expanded his psychosocial theory to include the three major stages of adult development. As with our earlier years, he proposed that each of the adult stages was accompanied by a particular crisis or challenge. He suggested that the challenge of early adulthood was between intimacy and isolation. The major goal of this period is to create relationships, lasting relationships, with other people. These could be with friends, families, or romantic partners. Middle adulthood's challenge is between generativity and stagnation. The major goal during this time is to be productive. This productivity could be directed in multiple ways, be it a job, family, the arts, hobbies, or other areas. Our late adulthood has the challenge of integrity or despair. The goal here is to feel that one has led a fulfilling and meaningful life. This challenge can also be met in many different ways. Have you heard the term midlife crisis? This is a term that means that an individual, usually in their 40s, is undergoing a period of psychological or emotional crisis. However, is a midlife crisis actually a common occurrence? The data seem to indicate that a midlife crisis is not really common. In fact, as you can see in this graph, emotional crises occur pretty consistently across all ages, with specific events actually driving the majority, rather than specific ages. In fact, this graph shows a downward spike in crisis in men in their early 40s. That being said, when are people the most satisfied with their lives? What do you think? Well, the good news here is that people tend to be equally satisfied across their entire lifespan. Thus, even with declines in physical, cognitive, and sensory abilities, people are still satisfied in middle and late adulthood. In our lives, we will undergo amazing transformations. Our bodies, minds, and relationships will develop and change. You've already undergone many physical, cognitive, and social changes in your lives already, with more to come. When we discuss the material in health and well-being, I hope you'll find ways to ensure that your years ahead are as fulfilling and as healthy as possible.